Welcome to Pentateuch. We're going to look at the last book in the Pentateuch, the book of Deuteronomy. And the theme of Deuteronomy is rededication to the Lord. So Jesus quoted Deuteronomy more than any other book. He quoted it 3 times during his temptation, and then he quoted it again in Matthew 22:37. God's word was written to be preached, to persuade listeners to be doers of the word, not hearers only. Deuteronomy 4:1 makes this point. And so all 5 books of the Pentateuch have a persuasive message. Genesis persuades us to be a blessing. Exodus, get redeemed. Leviticus, live a holy life. Numbers, do battle for God. Deuteronomy, rededicate your life to the Lord. Moses wrote Deuteronomy at the age of 120 on the plains of Moab, about 2 months before his death. Moses preached 3 sermons to persuade God's people to renew their commitment to God's will, to enter God's will, which is land, the land. Mentioned 200 times. That is the promised land, the land of Canaan. So here you see, here, this is where they're at, Moab, and they're getting ready to cross Jordan River into Canaan, or the promised land. So this is where Moses gives the book of Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law. That's the meaning of the word Deuteronomy. So the first sermon is rededicate your life because of God's past blessings in chapters 1-4. Second sermon, rededicate your life because of God's present commands, chapters 5-26. Third sermon, rededicate your life because of God's future blessings or cursings, chapter 27-30. So let's look at our format. Let's use our format here to say we're going to preach a sermon, teach a Bible study that gives an overview of the entire book of Deuteronomy, which is good to do sometimes. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus covered the entire Old Testament. So that was a big survey. But what would the MPS, main point of the sermon, be for the book of Deuteronomy? Right here. We must rededicate our lives to the Lord. What would the interrogative be? See the word because used 3 times here? That means that the interrogative would be, we must dedicate our lives to the Lord for the following reasons. And the interrogative would be, the interrogative question would be why? Why must we rededicate our lives to the Lord? And then the transition would be because. That's where we pick up this word, because of the following reasons. What would the first main division be? We must rededicate our lives to the Lord because of God's past blessings. Second main division, because of God's present commands. And the third main division would be because of God's future blessings or chastenings. And you remember under each main division you're going to have explanation, B, argumentation, C, illustration, D, application. And then you'll have your conclusion. There's a comparison of Deuteronomy with the Hittite treaties. Such treaties were written during the last half of the 2nd millennium, and every generation or after the change of a sovereign, that Hittite treaty was renewed. So the covenant was first made at Mount Sinai. 40 years later, it was renewed on the plains of Moab in Deuteronomy. And then 40 years later, it was renewed by Joshua at his death. So look at the comparisons. Both Deuteronomy and the Hittite treaties have a preamble or introduction. identified the Hittite sovereign as the one initiating the covenant with a vassal. And so you see God as identified as the sovereign. Then you have the historical prologue. You have the sovereign reviewing his kindness for the vassal nation. Then you have the stipulations. Then you have the blessings and cursings and the witnesses. So the book of Deuteronomy follows that pattern. It's just like in the New Testament when Paul followed the pattern of letter writing in his epistles. Unlike our writing of letters today, we say, dear so-and-so, and then we write the letter and we conclude with sincerely yours, and we give ourselves. That's not the way they wrote their letters in the first century. They identified themselves as the author at the very beginning, Paul to the Corinthians, for example. He was following the form of letter writing in his day. Moses is following the form of the Hittites when they made this big treaty. So the first sermon is this: rededicate your lives to the Lord because of God's past blessings. So like the Hittite treaty, he's going to renew and remember God's past blessings because God is the sovereign over his vassal nation, Israel. God's people delivered from bondage of slavery at Mount Sinai. So this is really a summary of the book of Numbers. God's people rebelled at Kadesh Barnea. God's people's needs were supplied in the wilderness wanderings. God's people given victory over their enemies in the Transjordan. So reviewing and reminding his people, God's people, of their past blessings, now he calls for them to rededicate themselves to the Lord because of his past blessings. And so he does this in chapter 4 by giving the purpose of the law, their experience at Sinai, the prohibition of idolatry, because Israel had this propensity to follow other gods, to fall into idolatry. And then the prediction of dispersion, and that prediction was fulfilled when the Assyrians came in 722 BC, when the Babylonians came in 606 BC. They disobeyed, they were chastened. And then remember God's works. Just remember, like Paul told Timothy and Peter told the believers he wrote to remember. And then you have this big, I think, New Testament rededication verse in Romans 12:1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service or your act of worship. And so the message of Deuteronomy to rededicate our lives to the Lord is a message that we can preach and teach to our people. And we could remind them of the past blessings in their lives. And so this book is, of course, very relevant.